On the Mount of Olives, Jesus' disciples asked him what signs there would be to signal his return and the end of the world. Jesus' response has become known as the Olivet Discourse. This is how Matthew records it. As Jesus was leaving the temple grounds, his disciples pointed out to him the various temple buildings. But he responded, "Do you see all these buildings? I tell you the truth, they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives. His disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will signal your return and the end of the world?" Jesus told them, "Don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah.' They will deceive many, and you will hear of wars and threats of wars. But don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world, but all this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. Then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers, and many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other." The very first thing that Jesus tells his disciples to watch out for is an increase in false religion led by false messiahs. John wrote, "Dear children, the last hour is here. You have heard that the Antichrist is coming, and already many such Antichrists have appeared. From this we know that the last hour has come." So prior to the appearance of the Antichrist, there will be many little Antichrists. This will be the first sign of his coming. Jesus then says that there will be an increase of war and threats of war. The geopolitical landscape will become increasingly tumultuous. There will be also an increase in famines and natural disasters. Jesus describes all these problems as birth pains. The significance of this metaphor is that birth pains increase in intensity and frequency as time rolls on. This is how it will be with all these things. Next, Jesus says, "Then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers, and many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other." How will this be a specific sign of the end? After all, if persecution has been normal throughout all history, it can hardly be considered a sign just because it's still happening at the end of time. However, the specific sign that Jesus is telling us about is that it will get noticeably worse. The birth pains metaphor applies once more. In fact, this is almost certainly describing a kind of end-time genocide. So bad will it be that many Christians will buckle under the pressure and for the sake of comfort, denounce their faith and join the crowd. Many Christians will even find themselves betrayed by those who should have been their friends and partners in the gospel. This puts us in mind of Judas betraying Christ himself. The news that Christianity is now the world's most persecuted religion isn't a surprise. The news that the persecution is increasing isn't a surprise. We're merely seeing the words of Jesus coming to life before our very eyes. We are witnessing the birth pains. Do birth pains ever get easier? Not at all. As such, we must look to the future knowing that things aren't going to get easier, they're going to get worse. Jesus continues on the Mount of Olives saying, "And many false prophets will appear and will deceive many people. Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And the good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world, so that all nations will hear it, and then the end will come." We're going to need endurance in the end times. Endurance right up until the very end. Sin is going to be rampant. People will become more selfish. Love is going to grow cold. This isn't a pleasant picture. Having given that general picture for the whole world, Jesus then focuses on the things that must occur specifically in Israel before the end comes. The day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place. Reader, pay attention. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills. A person out on the deck of a roof must not go down into the house to pack. A person out in the field must not return even to get a coat. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for nursing mothers in those days. And pray that your flight will not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For there will be greater anguish than at any time since the world began, and it will never be so great again. In fact, unless that time of calamity is shortened, not a single person will survive. but it will be shortened for the sake of God's chosen ones. Jesus is describing an end-time event known as Jacob's trouble, whereby Israel will be attacked and trampled upon during the reign of the Antichrist. This event was prophesied through the Old Testament prophets, and Jesus can't return until it has happened. The Old Testament prophet Daniel especially was given a lot of insight on this issue. He was told that the Antichrist would raise up an idolatrous statue on Temple Mount, and that would be their cue to flee to the wilderness. Those who don't escape would be persecuted severely and killed. Jeremiah also prophesied about this day when he said, "I hear cries of fear, there is terror and no peace." Now let me ask you a question. Do men give birth to babies? Then why do they stand there ashen-faced, hands pressed against their sides like a woman in labour? In all history, there has never been such a time of terror. It will be a time of trouble for my people Israel. God tells Israel that their allies will desert them at this time. All your lovers, your allies, have left you and do not care about you anymore. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians about this time as well, saying, "When people are saying everything is peaceful and secure, then disaster will fall on them as suddenly as a pregnant woman's labor pains begin, and there will be no escape." Notice how every single one of these verses about the end times, and specifically Israel's trouble, mentions birth pains. This is not coincidence. Things are going to get worse. Jesus continues with more information, saying, "Then if anyone tells you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'There he is,' don't believe it, for false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform great signs and wonders so as to deceive, if possible, even God's chosen ones. See, I have warned you about this ahead of time. So if someone tells you, 'Look, the Messiah is out in the desert,' don't bother to go and look. Or 'Look, he is hiding here,' don't believe it. For as the lightning flashes in the east and shines to the west, so it will be when the Son of Man comes. Just as the gathering of vultures shows there is a carcass nearby, so these signs indicate that the end is near." For a third time here, Jesus warns us against the deception of false religion. Clearly this is something he is very keen to stress. He tells us that when he returns, there won't be any doubt about it. The whole sky will light up like a flash of lightning to herald his return. Jesus then gives us a very important reference point. He says, "Immediately after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then at last, the sign that the Son of Man is coming will appear in the heavens, and there will be deep mourning among all the peoples of the earth. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a mighty blast of a trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of the earth and heaven." I've emphasized the word after and the words "and then at last" because they are giving us a chronological timeline of events. After the increase in false religion, after all of the false prophets, after the increase in wars and threats of wars, after the increase in natural disasters and famines, after the persecution of Christians, after many of those turn away from the faith, after the increase in sin which leads to the hardened hearts and cynicism, after the sacrilegious idol is set up in Jerusalem, after all of those things, the sun and moon will go dark and the stars will fall from the sky. And then at last, Jesus comes to gather his chosen ones from all over the world. Very simply, the timeline that Jesus sets out for us is suffering and tribulation first, then the sun and moon going dark, and then, at last, the rapture. There will be no rapture until after the tribulation and the sun and moon have gone dark. That means that many of God's people will be here for the famines and natural disasters. They'll be here for the increase in false religion and false prophets. They'll be here for the increase in wars. They'll be here for the increase in persecution and hatred. They'll be here for a time of destruction for Jerusalem. They'll be here until the lights go down. No wonder Jesus says to his followers that they will need endurance in those times. Will the Christian church go through the tribulation? That's the big question that everyone wants to know when they read the book of Revelation. And that's why I've started our study of the book here with this foundation. I wanted to highlight that the Bible promises us tribulation. It's natural and perhaps even necessary. I also wanted to highlight that throughout history, we have always had tribulation. It's rarely been any other way. And finally, I wanted to highlight that we currently do have tribulation. We have tribulation right now, today. The church is currently the most persecuted people group in the world. The Olivet Discourse simply tells us that it's going to get worse. And that's the sobering foundation that we must put in place before we turn to the book of Revelation itself.